In 1900, Frank Lloyd Wright delivered a speech which was later known as The Architect. 1. The difference between a businessman and a professional man. 2. How architecture lost its quality after it became commercial. 3. The detachment of architecture from art and its transformation into a commodity. The following are an excerpt from the original speech. 1. The difference between a businessman and a professional man. A vital difference between the professional man and the man of business is that money making to the professional man should be incidental. However, to the businessman, it should be primary. Money has its limitations. While it may buy quantity, there is something beyond it, and that is quality. When the practice of a profession of touching the art is assumed, certain obligations to the public concerning quality and beyond money-making are also assumed. Without their faithful discharge, the professional man degenerates to the weakest type of social menial in the entire system. An industrial parasite, an architect, practices a fine art as a profession, with the commercial and the scientific of his time as his technique. Men are his tools. 2. How architecture lost its quality after it became commercial. In the age of quantity, there is a growing tendency on the part of the public to disregard the architect in favor of the plan factory, magnate or architecture broker, and there is consequent confusion in the mind of the young architect of today and tomorrow. The confusion exists, and naturally enough, because the topography of his field of action has changed. But the spirit of practice and the old field is still sound to the core. The influence is chiefly responsible for this change and most easily recognized is that of science and commercialism. The tremendous forward march of scientific attainment which attendant new forces and resources, cultivation of the head at the cost of the heart, of mind and matter at the expense of the emotions, has nevertheless given to him new and masterful tools, because he has failed to realize and grasp his situation in its new bearing. He is not quite like his brother, the artist, a thing afraid of organization and its symbol, the machine, but the architect, the master of creative effort, whose province it was to make imperishable record of the noblest in the life of his race in his time. For the time being, he has been caught in the commercial rush and whirl and hypnotized into trying to be the commercial himself. 3. The detachment of architecture from art and its transformation into a commodity. The architect has dragged his ancient monuments to the marketplace, tortured them with ribs of steel. Architecture has become a commodity. The architect has small standing except as he measures his success by the volume of business he transacts. Divorced from fine art, the architect is something yet to be classified. A good salesman as something that they can understand and appreciate when, as far as the commodity he is selling, it has been dead to them so long. The commodity is as dead to the salesman as to the buyer. The present generation of the successful architect has been submerged, overwhelmed by the commercialism of his time. He has become a high-grade salesman of a high-priced imported article. His duty to the public as a professional man has been laid aside. What has been gained by his feverish haste to offer his art on the altar of commercial sacrifice has been quantity at expense to quality, a general depreciation of architecture values. In consequence, its architecture today has not even commercial integrity. Does a sale of property appear in a trade journal? Immediately the owner is besigned by 10 first-class architects, suing for the privilege of submitting samples free of charge, assuring the owner, meanwhile, that he would be granting a personal favor in permitting them to do so, and if the samples were not what he wanted, they would love each other nonetheless. Or his friend drops in shortly after the owner decides to build and incidentally mention so and so as a good fellow and a winning architect. The latest development is the hiring of a professional promoter by the year to drum up trade and talk to the best of him concerning professional advertising, making capital of himself in subtle, telling ways. How many architects would live if they depended upon the work that came to them because of intelligent, critical appreciation of actual qualifications or work performed? Probably about 7% of the profession, because the matter of architecture itself has become of little moment to the average client. Architecture as a fine art is really out of it, and for the present, architecture as a commodity is a case of friendly favor and interference or a matter of fashion. We have now reached the end of part 1 of this video. In the second part, we will be discussing the rest of Mr. Wright's speech, where he talks about how architecture should and how the architects themselves should act in order to save their profession. In 1957, Frank Lloyd Wright, known as a creative master in American architecture, gave a speech in the Fine Arts Building of the 1893 Columbian Exposition in Chicago. In his speech, Mr. Wright discusses what is the meaning of the word architect, what is architecture, how did the Beaux Arts affect American architecture, and how did the prayer movement evolve as American architecture started. The following are an excerpt from the original speech. The meaning of the word architect. Can somebody tell me what is the meaning of the word architect really is? I've asked so many young people and always got no for an answer. Well, it's strange that you should wear the name architect all of your life and never know what the word means, isn't it? Now, is there anybody here who can give the meaning of the word architect? Well, the word arch, the archbishop, arch means the top. It means way up above everything. Really a master. Now, what does tech means? You know that. Technician, technology, it means know-how, knowing the way and the means. Tech, architect. There you have the master of the know-how. What is architecture? What does architecture mean to you? An architect builds buildings, doesn't he? He is supposed to know why he builds those buildings. He is supposed to do something in the design and construction of those buildings that makes them eloquent of their purpose, that makes them features of their site so that they grace it and do not disgrace it. In other words, it's a great mother art, architecture. And for 500 years, architecture has been more or less a cliché, more or less an exterior, not true to conditions, not true to life. Beaux Arts. All of the architecture that we knew anything about in America, where the architect had come from, was a Beaux Arts graduate, and therefore he was inoculated with the major axes and the temple forms and the columns and all that. But somehow that didn't square in my mind or in the mind of Louise H. Sullivan, in the minds of Dankmar Adler and a few other people at the time. With this declaration of independence, we had declared something new in the world, and that was the sovereignty of the individual, and that was a very brave thing in government to do. If we were going to go on building buildings in the old way where monarchic dominated, they were all the product of authority. None of them were the children or expression of freedom. Freedom of spirit, freedom of soul. So, we were up against, as I saw it, with a necessity for a culture of our own, an expression of our own, worthy of the greatest gifts of ground the world has ever seen anywhere. Most beautiful, most extensive, beyond imagination. No nation ever inherited such a material wealth as we inherited. So what to do with it? We had no means of doing anything with it except as we tried to make over or in some way modify these old patterns of an old life and an old civilization not at all like ours. So something had to be born in a new spirit, the new architecture expression. How are we going to satisfy the conditions of this new life? Here is the machine. The machine began imitating in architecture those things which had been done by hand. Well, they soon looked pretty dead and pretty tough and not worthy of man's time. So, someone had to devise ways and means of building whereby the machine could render even more beautifully than ever before the nature of the material the nature of the steel. We didn't understand anything until we began to dig in and find out what the nature of these things really amounted architecturally. How to express wood as wood. Now, of course, wood is the tree, the greatest friend of a man. He feels it too. Stone is under his feet, the ribs of the earth he inhabits. And here comes glass as an entirely new material to keep air out. And all these new things lying there that the Greeks never knew anything about. I'm sure that if the Greeks had known these materials that we've discovered, we would be copying the Greeks now. We wouldn't be building anything but Greek buildings. We've had to fight integrity that was lacking in the Beaux Arts performance. It was lacking in the kind of building that we are in here now. And we had to come out with something that had a fresh new expression of contents, at least if not integrity of feature, and we went in that direction, studied it, worked hard at, came out with certain simple forms that belong to the prayer here. The prayer and individuality, that's a feature of architecture. The thing has to belong there where it stands, as much of it as possible. It has to be true to the materials of which it is built, which may be what? Steel and glass largely now, and also various other things. For the first time, we began to build according to a human scale. The old grandomania, as you know, took into effect only giving humanity an inferiority complex. That was the aim, of course, and the result of the old Gothic architecture was much the same. Make a man feel small, and he was small in these days. The individual didn't amount to much, but now all of this has changed. Here in America, the individual did amount a great deal. So we took the scale of the human being as the new scale. You've got the properties of steel. A property used in construction is the stand like the spider spinning. Steel can give indefinite span, indefinite lightness of span. And here comes glass to use and large open surfaces filling these spans lightly, and there you had an architecture that the Greeks knew nothing about. Goth knew nothing about. In fact, the Goths tried for this delicacy and width and span and everything by way of stone until the stone began to fall down, until the buildings began to fall. They carried it as far as it could be carried. The first American architects did not know much about steel and its properties. They reduced it to a facade, and all you had to do with a facade after you got it was to devise some type of wallpaper pattern for the face of it and hang in there or plaster it on. So the architect became a facade mummer and a paper hanger more or less on a steel frame. Now, all the elemental things are inherent in the nature of architecture today, and only as you study nature. And nature doesn't mean horses and cows and streams and storms only. That's only one little element. Nature means the essential significant life of the thing, whatever the thing is. I prefer to say that nature is the only body of God that we shall ever see. If we wish to know the truth concerning anything, we will find it in the nature of that thing. So today, we are pretty well in advance of nearly everything this way of the flesh. Concrete becomes the flesh of our modern world, and steel becomes the fibrous integument in the flesh, just as it is in you, as it is in the tree. And now we build as nature builds, from the inside out. We no longer think of building frames such as you see all over the city, in cities such as the United States, and then trying to do something with exterior to make them attractive facades. The mother art is architecture. Without an architecture of our own, we have no soul of our own civilization. Now, of course, architecture is a blind spot of our life in America today. How many millions of students go to university to be educated? They come away conditioned, not enlightened, and they know nothing about architecture.